Hi, it's Dr. Crone again. Welcome to the second video in our Unit 1 study. In this video, we'll build on what we learned in the previous one. Here we'll be discussing how political scientists use the comparative method to try to answer important questions about government and politics. First, let's start with a broad why question. Why do people want to study government and politics anyway? Since political science is part of the social sciences, let's start by looking at their goal. So the goal of all social science is to understand human societies. Social science describes disciplines like political science, geography, economics, anthropology, sociology, all of which has that common goal to understand how people live together in societies. The goal of political science specifically is to understand political systems within modern human societies. How do people create politics? Why do they create them? And how does that work? Finally, within comparative politics, the goal is to understand how political systems develop, function, and change by comparing them with one another. In other words, by using the comparative method. Table 1.1 in your textbook shows you some research questions that comparative political scientists are interested in. I also want to share on this slide some of the research questions asked by working political scientists who published their findings in a recent edition of an academic journal. So in the September 2019 issue of Comparative Political Studies, various papers were published looking into these research questions. What affects different levels of citizen support for democracy? What affects different percentages of women's representation in legislatures? Why do some democratic countries abolish term limits for their presidency to allow an individual president to stay in office longer? What leads to the initial emergence of a democracy? All of these questions are what political scientists call empirical questions. Academic researchers divide research questions into two categories, empirical questions and normative questions. Empirical questions are questions that can be answered with information or evidence about the world around us. An example of a comparative political science empirical question is, why do countries with high levels of economic development tend to become democracies? Normative questions, on the other hand, are ethical or moral questions. They ask questions like what should be or whether it's right to have something. So ethical or moral questions might be things like, should all countries become democracies? Or should all countries aim for high levels of economic development? These are the should or ethical questions. For the most part, social science work is concerned mostly with empirical questions. Not all. Some social science work is definitely working on normative questions, but a lot of social science has to do with empirical questions. Basically, at heart, social scientists are people who like to base their conclusions on data. Scientific researchers of all kinds use a similar process to answer empirical research questions, and we call this the research process. It has 5 steps, so we're going to look at those. The first step is to develop a hypothesis. Then the step of conceptualization, which is, what do I mean by the ideas in my hypothesis? Operationalization, once I know what I mean, how do I measure those concepts? Then we collect empirical evidence on those measures, and we use that evidence to decide whether to support or reject our hypothesis. So an example research question would be the one on the previous slide. Why do countries with high levels of economic development tend to become democracies? For the next several slides, we're going to take that research question here through the 5 steps. The first step in the research process is to develop a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a possible answer to a research question. A researcher begins their research with what they think, they have a hunch, might be a good answer to their research question. And then they use this research process to try to answer the question and to try to decide whether their hypothesis is supported by empirical evidence. So how do researchers come up with a hypothesis? Well, there are infinite ways. Most researchers get their ideas either from curious observation of the political world or from curious reading of the work of other political scientists. So let's look at an example hypothesis to answer our research question. This hypothesis was actually developed by a famous political scientist named Seymour Martin Lipset. We'll learn more about his research in our unit on democracy. But for now, let's look at Lipset's hypothesis. He said he thought that economic development created democracy because it tends to create an educated middle class. Once there's an educated middle class in a society, those people who have an education are most likely to push for more political participation in a democratic form of government. Conceptualization is an important part of the research process, and it's really a tricky one. With conceptualization, we have to decide what we mean by the terms we're using. The goal is to use or create a concept so that those who read our work understand what we're talking about and can try and replicate it. Usually in an academic discipline, there are agreed on conceptualizations of many concepts. For example, economists have a conceptualization of economic development. They conceptualize it as a process that brings higher levels of economic well-being and quality of life to a nation. Democracy tends to be conceptualized by political science in its modern form as a government system that allows for free participation of citizens in political life, particularly through election of decision makers. The middle class is even trickier. Sociologists there are still arguing about what do they mean by the middle class? Who exactly is in the middle class? For Lipset's research example, though, the concepts of economic development, democracy, and the middle class already had a fairly strong conceptualization. Sometimes, though, a researcher will develop a totally new concept, which then requires careful definition and description so that readers can understand it and use it. Note that conceptualization is more of a definition. It's very different than the idea of how we will measure the concept. It's easy to get confused between conceptualization and measurement. The measurement step in the research process is called operationalization. That word simply means measurement, but it's not always as simple as it seems. We have to find ways to measure our concepts so that we are capturing in data what our conceptualization means. Some concepts are very simple to operationalize. For example, we could easily measure the size of a population of a country. Others are more difficult. Later in this course, we'll explore how political scientists measure the two concepts listed on this slide, economic development and democracy. Once we have our hypothesis, our conceptualization, and a way to measure that concept, we're ready to actually collect our evidence. The collection of evidence requires us to decide which countries we will collect data for and to apply our operational measures to those countries. We'll look at more examples of how we do that later on in this video. Once our data has been gathered, we can test our hypothesis using statistical tests. If you've taken statistics, you've heard about measures like correlation and p-values and crosstabs. We're not going to need to know those things for this course, but if you go on in political science, you will certainly run into them. We can apply statistical tests to our data to find out whether there is a statistically significant relationship between the variables we're interested in. Once we test our hypothesis, we can finally examine our statistical results and decide whether to accept or reject our hypothesis. We interpret the results of the statistical tests. For example, in simple statistical tests of correlation, a positive and significant correlation is supportive of our hypothesis. So if we come out with a significant relationship between our variables that's statistically significant, we can say that it supports our hypothesis, but we can never say that it proves it. Lack of a correlation or lack of a positive or the existence of a negative correlation would be a reason to reject the hypothesis. So it's easier to reject a hypothesis than it is to actually accept it. Accepting a hypothesis takes a long time and more than just one research project. So when Seymour Martin Lipset tested his hypothesis here with a large N study, he found strong support for it. So he said his results were supportive of his hypothesis. But just because the statistical results supported the hypothesis didn't mean he'd proven the hypothesis. Science can never actually prove anything. Rather, what we can say is that we have evidence that supports it, or that we have evidence that shows that the negative hypothesis is probably not true. In fact, there's actually a case in the world that we'll learn more about later on in this course that actually contradicts Seymour Martin Lipset's findings. Yes, it's true. Even the great Seymour Martin Lipset's hypothesis has at least one exception, which is the country of India. India developed a democracy long before it became economically developed. In fact, India is still quite poor, but its democracy has been robust for decades. This doesn't mean Lipset's ideas were wrong. It just shows that social science is complicated and needs to be approached with an open, non-rigid mind. In all scientific research, the most important quality of a scientist is to be cautious in interpreting their results. Staying cautious and scientific is the key to success. Remember, there's almost no way to prove a hypothesis is true. The best we can do is say, there's probably something going on here with this data. We must be very careful not to attribute causation hastily. It's extremely hard to prove without time series or experimental data, and we can't experiment with countries. With most statistics, the best we can say is that there seems to be a relationship. There are lots of ways to prove a hypothesis is false. Negative results mean we have to reject the hypothesis. At the very least, we have to reconceptualize or reoperationalize it to retest it. If a hypothesis receives lots of support from various researchers across various time periods, we become more and more convinced that it is probably reasonable to call it true. Once that happens, we can start calling something a theory. A theory in science is the gold standard of scientific research. It doesn't mean a non-supported idea the way it's often used in common language. A theory is a hypothesis that has received tons of support from more than one researcher across a long period of time with very little contradiction. True scientists are patient and skeptical creatures who make limited claims rather than broad sweeping ones. You can develop this critical thinking skill as well anytime you read the results of a scientific study in the news. Journalists often make far broader claims when they report on new studies than the scientists themselves make. For example, consider a study that shows a correlation between coffee drinking and heart attacks. Scientists who do the study may state that they have some support for that hypothesis, but there will be others who caution that it needs much more study and replication before they accept the conclusion. But a journalist who gets their hands on the study will trumpet the news and say, "Stop drinking coffee now, it causes heart attacks." Be cautious consumers of journalistic reports of scientific breakthroughs. Now that we know more about the research process in general, let's look at how the comparative method works in political science research. There are 4 types of comparative research designs. There's the case study design, the large N design, the most similar systems design, and the most different systems design. Let's look in more depth at each type and look at some examples. The first type of research design is the case study design, and this looks deeply at just one country as an example. It gathers lots and lots of evidence of the concepts from that country, and it uses that country to support a general hypothesis. An example of a case study would be to take a version of our hypothesis and apply it to one country, South Africa. So let's say that we want to look at our idea of whether economic development leads to democratization in a country. We could do a lot of research on South Africa's history and on their economy and their economic development, and we could look and see that South Africa became a democracy after it gained more wealth and its economy grew and developed. Therefore, we might say that our case study supports the hypothesis that in all countries, economic development leads to democracy. We could say that South Africa supports that, but remember, it's just one case. Case studies have a lot of weaknesses to them. It's a limited method. It can't tell us whether the hypothesis is supported in other countries. And as we already pointed out, India is a contradiction of this same hypothesis. So if all we studied was India, we wouldn't be able to support our hypothesis. If we just study South Africa, we would. South Africa, also, any individual country is going to have lots of exceptions and lots of uniqueness in its history. Certainly South Africa's history is much different than lots of other countries' history because of its history of colonization and apartheid. So case studies are very good because we can get a lot of deep information, but they're not as good at supporting our hypotheses because, again, it is just one case. The next type of research design is the large N design, and it is very much the opposite of the case study. The letter N there means the number of countries in the study, and so a large N design means it has lots of countries. The large N design says study as many countries as possible, as many as you can get data for, and that will tell us whether the hypothesis fits lots of different scenarios. So that has a lot of advantages, and its advantages sort of outweigh some of the problems of a case study design. The disadvantages are that it can be very expensive and not very practical to study complicated concepts in every single country in the world. And so therefore, in a large N design, you're sort of limited to the type of questions that can be answered by readily available measurements. So it's often used for economic or demographic hypotheses, demographic meaning having to do with the population, because economic and demographic data, geographic data, are readily available and very easy to use for comparison. You don't even have to do field work. You can just sit in your computer in your office and do the work. So we could definitely use the large N design to test our hypothesis because it's easy to find measures of economic development and level of democracy for every country in the world. And that's basically what our friend Mr. Lipset did back in the 1960s. But most questions in comparative political science can't be answered using a large N study because there's not enough readily available data. For example, I have a friend who's a comparative political scientist who studies violence against women and government responses to that. But the problem is that in lots and lots of countries, there are no records kept on violence against women. So she's had to narrow her studies to countries where that information is available. So many research questions just don't apply to every country either. So the majority of comparative research that is done with what we call small N studies. Meaning a small number of countries. And there's two kinds of small N studies in comparative politics. There's the most similar systems design and the most different systems design. So the most similar systems design has us choosing two or more countries that are very similar to each other, but that differ in some important way that we want to know about. So in the textbook, you can read all about that on table 1.5. It'll tell you about that. So we're going to ask a why question about that difference, and then hypothesize about a variable that's different that could be the cause. So we're going to control in a similar system, we're going to control for lots of things. We're going to say, well, these countries are almost the same on in many aspects, but they're different in some aspects. And why is there that difference? And how can we find another variable that's different that might also be causing the difference? So a good example would be, why have Britain and Germany both had female heads of government while the United States has not? So Britain, Germany, and the United States are all very similar. They're Western countries with a mostly white/European majority population. They both have the same number of women and men, as do all countries in the world. They have very similar government type systems. They're established democracies. They have similar economies. Why have two of them had female heads of government while the other one hasn't? So that is an example of a most similar systems kind of a research question. The other type of small n design is the most different systems design, and this is kind of the opposite, and you'll find more of this in your textbook, and also table 1.6 is very helpful for this. So it basically uses the opposite logic of the most similar systems. Here we're going to choose two or more countries that are really, really different, but are similar in some important way. And we're going to ask a why question about the similarity and hypothesize about another variable that's similar that could be the cause. So a good research question for a most different systems design would be, why do the United States and Nigeria both have presidential systems of government rather than parliamentary? One of the hypothesized reasons is that both of them were unhappy colonies of Britain, and Britain had a parliamentary system. So the theory or the hypothesis here is that countries that threw off Great Britain and didn't like being British developed a different system of government. So that's an example of what they have in common, even though the United States and Nigeria are otherwise very, very different from each other. All right, that's all for this video. You can find out more information about that in the book as well. Here's your second topic for the discussion board this week. So I want you to think about a country that you know fairly well, but that you're curious about. And I want you to propose an empirical question, that's going to be a why or a how question, about that country's government that you are curious about, and then speculate on how you might find out the answer. Maybe speculate on a hypothesis, or say, well, I could measure these things. Just be thinking about a little idea for research that you might have. We're not actually going to do this research, so it doesn't have to be anything practical, but I just want you to get some experience in thinking about empirical research questions. Okay, I am looking forward to reading our discussion board for this unit. I wish all of you the best of luck as you start off your work in this class. Have a great week.